Portland Parabnormal. Welcome to this new podcast exclusively on Talkcast PDX. I'm Jeremy Scott. You know, Parabnormal, as you heard Johnny Cobb and Jerry McCoy, who do our official theme song, Parabnormal. It's a brand I started back in 2015. It's somewhere between abnormal and paranormal. That allows us to talk about more than just the paranormal on a weekly basis, which we do on Saturday nights over at parabnormalradio.com. And, you know, living here in the cesspool of Portland, and you will know if you are here in Portland listening, that the cesspool-ishness is at an all-time high. And that's when we decide to launch Keep Portland Parabnormal exclusively here on Talkcast PDX. Because believe it or not, there is more paranormal, there's more parabnormal, as I refer to it, than probably the ordinary person would believe. And when you talk about the rich history of ghost stories and strange activity, there are many haunted locations around the Portland area. And to name a few, off the top of my head, Lone Fir Cemetery, the Shanghai Tunnels, the White Eagle, Old Town Pizza as well. I just learned about that one within the past year, actually. And so on our debut episode, I've got the perfect one here to talk about this. My friend Rocky Smith, he's a lifelong resident of Oregon City and has become well known as a local historian and paranormal investigator. In college, Rocky worked 3 years in the historic Ermitinger House, the oldest house in Oregon City and the third oldest in the state of Oregon. Rocky has had many paranormal experiences over the past 20 years in the Ermitinger House, including the first experience of his, which was featured in Susan Smitten's book, Ghost Stories of Oregon. Rocky started researching the paranormal activity in Oregon City in 1995 and has documented close to 100 haunted places within the city. In 2006, Rocky combined his love for history and knowledge of the paranormal, founded Northwest Ghost Tours, and now leads the Walk with the Spirits tours in Oregon City. And he's also director of the quickly growing Oregon Ghost Conference, which we hope to be having here in 2021 after a hiatus in 2020 due to COVID-19. And Rocky also wears many hats as well outside the paranormal field. In fact, he was awarded Teacher of the Year at Oregon City High School in 2006 and 2007. He was awarded Oregon City's Citizen of the Year for 2013. And there's so much going on that we don't have time to talk to him about. But Rocky Smith is here, and welcome to Keep Portland Parabnormal. How are you?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm wonderful. It's good to have you here. You know, it's always fascinating to be able to go to McMiniman's, wherever we're at, and to sit down in the theater and to get some food, some Cajun tots or whatever, maybe a little alcoholic beverage if you care, or a cider. They have really good cider, I think. And if you're at the right one, they got that turkey sandwich with the relish. Have you ever had that one, Rocky?
No. Oh. I stick with the, either hamburgers or Scooby snacks, which are the little mini corn dogs.
Can't go wrong with those.
And the Cajun tots. But yeah, remember back in the old days when we used to do that? Like, we used to be able to go to a restaurant and a theater, and I can't wait to go back, actually.
Yeah, because, you know, as you sit down, and then here's Rocky Smith, and he's up there and he's telling these ghost stories, and they kind of dim the lighting, and it just kind of brings that ambiance. And so with that in mind, as it gets really dark here on this Wednesday night, our debut on Talkcast PDX, as it starts to get dark, and you maybe have a candle out or you're dimming the lights, Rocky, are there more haunted places or locations with paranormal happenings around the Portland area, you think, than many of us would believe?
Yeah, I think so. I actually got a phone call a few years back from Reader's Digest, which I was shocked by because I was like, is that still a thing? And Reader's Digest was investigating and kind of writing articles about the most haunted cities in America. And so they wanted to talk to me about Portland. And clearly, Portland stands out as one of the more haunted cities, especially on the West Coast. But I kind of clued them in, and my background in Oregon City, I basically said, well, actually, Oregon City is more haunted than Portland. And so actually what happened was they ended up listing like the, top haunted cities in America, like New Orleans and Washington D.C. and Gettysburg and different things like that, and then there was Oregon City in that list, which I thought was pretty amazing. But they didn't have any stock photos of Oregon City, of course, so they had a picture of Portland. But Portland, I think, has always been kind of known to be a haunted place because of its history in the West, the underground, all the things that you kind of mentioned at the start of this talk. But and then this idea of this image that we've kind of put out there of this gloomy kind of Northwest that kind of also adds to those stories. So I think I do actually think it's one of the more haunted places in the Northwest. But I think part of our climate and our sometimes our this idea of us being up here in the winter months, kind of being depressed, that adds to that too.
Yeah.
You mentioned this, the cesspool, I guess. I don't know that's maybe the right word, but yeah, there is this gloominess.
Have you been downtown lately, Rocky?
Oh yeah, you're right. Yeah, you're right. I've avoided it. It is very sad what's going on downtown.
I do not have that pleasure, unfortunately.
Right.
Yeah. So, but there are many locations in downtown that are haunted. Old Town Pizza, I mentioned that one. That was one of the ones that I actually heard about reading Jeff Davis's book.
Okay, yeah.
I actually saw him at a McMinimans about a year ago, I think it was. Bought his book, flew through it, and here's Old Town Pizza.
Old Town Pizza. It's one of my favorite places. In fact, I had my 40th birthday party there a few years back. It's
just last year, right?
No, I'm 43, so that was a few years ago.
I wasn't trying to date you. You should have just nodded.
But Old Town Pizza is one of those iconic places where you feel the history when you go in there. It's a unique part of Portland's history, and so I love that place. Partly because of the ghost stories, but partly because of the neighborhood that it's in, and the kind of aura of the building itself. It's a cool place.
And so that's down there just off of Burnside, just south of Burnside, I think roughly between like 2nd and 3rd or 3rd and 4th, somewhere down there. Cooch and Davis in the Old Town. That's where it gets its name, Old Town Pizza.
Yeah. Well, the one thing that's kind of interesting about so many of Portland's ghost stories, there is the ghost stories, and then over time they kind of get added to and exaggerated upon, and so it's very hard to tell sometimes. And we found this in some of the McMinimans locations, that sometimes the legends and the folklore kind of outweigh the historic facts. But in Old Town Pizza, there's a woman, there's a ghost that they call Nina, and the belief was that she died, falling down the elevator shaft, something like that. There's a brick actually in the back part of Old Town Pizza. There's some bricks where there's carvings into them and stuff like that, so people write their name, and that has been added to over the years. And there is a name Nina carved into one of the bricks that they kind of attribute to the ghost. Now, I can't myself believe that the ghost actually carved that in there, but I think that that's just a way to honor that story and that spirit. And Old Town Pizza, of course, is kind of over the top of the old underground, or what we would call, most people call, the Shanghai tunnels. It's right there with near Hobos and in that area of the downtown.
Now, when we talk about a ghost or a spirit or an entity, some folks might get different perceptions, and so what do you believe for that when you encounter a spirit? Do you think it's energy that just exists? Do you think it is a departed soul that you're coming in contact with? Any guesstimate or thought on that, Rocky?
A lot of thought on that, but not a whole lot of answers. So I am careful with that. And as you know from probably hearing me before and my tours and things, I try not to define it. I like to kind of talk about the history and the factual information and the folklore and put them all together and talk about what is happening in these places, both the facts and the folklore, but then let people kind of decide what they want to interpret that as. And I have been asked many times whether I believe in ghosts, and I say, well, I don't know what that word means. I kind of use the word ghost and spirits interchangeably. I have this open mind and belief that, it could be in some cases could actually be the spirit of a person that's passed on. In some cases, I think it could just be an energy. So I haven't really completely defined that, although there's certain places where I've gone where, you can kind of feel that, okay, maybe this is just a reoccurring thing in time, and it's not necessarily the spirit of a person. Maybe this is just some kind of energy that affects this place. And then other times you feel like maybe it is more than that it is maybe the spirit of a person, because you can connect it to a story of the person that lived there in the past and what they're doing. And I think that's what makes it so interesting. I think the idea that we don't know the specifics of that is what makes us so interested in wanting to learn more.
Piggybacking on what Rocky said, not every ghost story or every haunted location does have a history of death, although in many of these cases there is a history. There's a history of death in the Pittock Mansion, which is another one of these locations in the Portland area, kind of up by Maclay Park, high above the hills of Portland, Rocky.
One of my favorite places, too. I love the Pittock Mansion. I talk about the Pittock Mansion quite a bit, too, on some of my talks. And I equate that with Oregon City a little bit, because in Oregon's, kind of paranormal ghost stories, we have this kind of myth that the old haunted mansions are like where the most haunted activity is, or the most paranormal activity is. And so in Oregon City, we have what would be considered the oldest, Oregon haunted mansion, which is the McLaughlin House. And yet there's other places in Oregon City that are more haunted than that. And the Pittock Mansion is kind of the Oregon's haunted mansion for the 1900s. And if anyone talks about haunted mansions in Portland, that house comes up almost to the top every time. And because it has that image of what we expect a haunted place to be, and plus that image of that house has been used in horror movies and all sorts of other, kind of imagery that adds to that effect, kind of like Timberline Lodge. But yet in reality, it's not as haunted as so many of the other places. Georgiana and Mr. Pittock basically, died within a few years of building the house. And so there's this idea that they didn't have the time to, kind of live out their dream living in the house, and so that they're still there. And the windows of the house open, and, there's this general smell of roses that takes over the house, and there's a feeling that there's a presence in the house. But in terms of, really amazing, what I would call really interactive kind of paranormal activity or seeing things. That just doesn't happen so much there.
Is it common that you see a lot of this activity when you visit these locations, or is most of this activity witnessed after the fact, like through digital recordings? In your experience?
I would say a little bit of both. For me, though, I see things out of the corner of my eye, so I kind of block some of it out, honestly, because I don't really want to be the kind of person that sees things everywhere I go. So I think I have a subconscious
I see dead people.
What? Yes, exactly. And I'm not sure I want to see dead people. So I'll see things out of the corner of my eye. For me personally, my experience usually is just a feeling. I can walk into a haunted building and I'll get a feeling, an energy that just hits me. And sometimes it's an emotion. I can't see what's causing it or describe the spirit or anything like that, but I can get a feeling. And then it basically starts as just a gut feeling. And then when I kind of start to acknowledge it, then I'll actually pick up more of an emotion of what that spirit or what that energy is kind of emanating. So, and that's when it really starts bothering me, because then it's like, okay, something's really wrong here. And so then I have to balance that. And so I'm pretty careful with it, and I'm, intrigued by it, but I'm also skeptical of it.
And I think folks should be. That is a very healthy attitude when it comes to dealing with paranormal subjects. And for those who are listening on Talkcast PDX who have never really heard a show about the paranormal, I don't think anybody is saying that everything is paranormal. You have to have a skeptical analysis of it, and take a look at it objectively. And there are certain things that can be ruled out, and we'll of course be talking with paranormal investigators as the weeks go on here on the show, and we'll get into some of those techniques and talk about how they do ghost busting and that sort of things. Rocky, time for a few more of these locations. They're ones that I mentioned earlier, so I want to make sure we can give some history on those. And those would be the Lone Fir Cemetery, the White Eagle Saloon, and also the Shanghai Tunnels. And the Shanghai Tunnels, I think probably out of all the ones we've talked about tonight, probably has the most international attention. Would you say?
Yeah, and I think I have mixed feelings about that, because I think, as I do tours myself, I talk to a lot of people that have done tours, or go on the tours or go into the Shanghai Tunnels. I've been into the Shanghai Tunnels several times over the years, many times actually, and a couple times in private investigations. And yes, the Shanghai Tunnels in Portland are pretty active. I think that it's partly the story, though, that makes it so unique and interesting, and kind of the debate about it. Yes, there's tunnels under Portland. There's still, some debate about what the tunnels were used for, but we know that generally there were tunnels under most cities. Oregon City had a tunnel system, Pendleton, Seattle, so that's not an uncommon thing. But the question really is, what were those tunnels used for? And I think people have debated that over the years. There's some factual information on that. But it's this intrigue of it, and this idea that there's a tunnel system under the city, which I think really intrigues people. And I think they get a little bit disappointed when they actually go and visit it, because what's left really is just basements of buildings. The connections, or what we would assume is or would see as tunnels, don't really exist anymore, because of flooding issues and closing in the actual connections, or construction with new buildings, or construction with light rail or streetcar systems. So, I think people have this image of this kind of glamour, or this idealistic image of this tunnel system, and kind of going underground and going through this whole city, but that just is not the case anymore. And so I think people sometimes are disappointed when they actually go there. But it is.
But back in the day, that was rad.
Right. Right. And I mean, I think, it's very active down there, but, you're still just in the basement of a building. And I think the history is really intriguing. The whole history of Portland, both on the east and the west side. But I think some of that has evolved into, a lot of folklore too, because even some of the talks about White Eagle, which I do a lot of talks at, talks about a possibility that the White Eagle was connected to a tunnel system. And, there's just no proof of that. So, you can kind of go through those and it's very hard to prove all these detailed things because if that a lot of the use of the tunnel systems were illegal, and so that's not something you just find articles about or documents about.
Illegal for all sorts of illegal activities like, maybe drug running. And, of course, the Shanghai name comes from basically taking drunken sailors and then putting them on a boat and taking them out to sea.
Right, and I think that I think there's some evidence that happened. Whether that was the sole use of the tunnels, I think is the debate. The tunnels, especially in other cities, were used for, like everything you could imagine. But alcohol during Prohibition, and opium dens and prostitution and gambling. I mean, there's all kinds of uses of these undergrounds, not just in Portland, but in all these cities.
Have you ever seen condiments be thrown across the kitchen?
No.
Apparently that's one of the stories there at the White Eagles. There was a bartender and a cook who died. This was in the days of pre-prohibition, and now has been seen apparently, and he likes to fling condiments about the kitchen.
Right. So the kitchen, if you've been into the White Eagle, the kitchen is a very tiny little space, and there's a mix of stories there because the stairway to the basement is actually through the kitchen. So you go into this little teeny space that is this kitchen, and then there's a stairway down from the kitchen into the basement. And Jeff Davis talks about this in his book too, and he actually did a paranormal TV show talking about this years ago. Where there's kind of this bouncer figure, this guy that was supposedly worked at the White Eagle that shoves people down the stairs in that kitchen area. And that's kind of, this story that's been told. And then they kind of give him this identity as I think a Chinese man. And actually Portland and Oregon City and all of these cities had a lot of different immigrants coming into this area, and the Chinese laborers that, built the railroad system and all this. So there was a large amount of Chinese immigrants in the Portland area. There's a connection there to Lone Fir Cemetery as well, because that's another one of my favorite places. That whole area of Lone Fir Cemetery that is now fenced in the cemetery, which is a vacant lot, was where a lot of the people from Hawthorne's Asylum were cremated and buried, and then some of the Chinese laborers were buried in that area of Lone Fir Cemetery in unmarked graves. And they have recently discovered that was part of the cemetery, and they're now trying to build a memorial there. The history there is incredible, and I think that's what makes this so fascinating to me, is being from Oregon City, the connection with Oregon City's history to Portland, but also the connection between all these haunted places in the history, whether it's connected with the underground or the time period, or even in some cases the individuals themselves. Like Pittock had a connection to Oregon City. Lone Fir Cemetery is where Asa Lovejoy is buried, who was one of the founders of the city of Portland, who was a resident of Oregon City. So they're just, this history is so intertwined that it just connects all together and makes it even more fascinating. Even the Ghost Conference in Seaside has a connection, because the Chinese laborers built the railroad for Ben Holiday, and Ben Holiday is the reason that Seaside is a city, because he built his, kind of resort house out there, and it became a resort and a place that people from Portland would take the railroad out to and visit. And that's why his Seaside house became the namesake of the city of Seaside. So that's why it's fascinating to me. It's the ghost stories, but also this interconnection of the history of the entire Northwest that makes me just super fascinated.
And a fascinating episode it was here on our debut. Rocky, tell us about Northwest Ghost Tours and the Oregon Ghost Conference.
Well, I do Northwest Ghost Tours. I do Haunted Oregon City tours. I'm hoping that my tours will kick off again, hopefully this summer. And the website for that is northwestghosttours.com or hauntedoregoncity.com. And then the Oregon Ghost Conference, we hope will take place maybe in some hybrid way in Seaside, March 26th through 28th. And the website for that is oregonghostconference.com.
Rocky, thank you so much for sharing some of these strange and weird and ghostly parabnormal stories from Portland. Perfect for our debut episode.
Thank you, Jeremy. I hope to be back, and I hope to see you in Seaside in March.
Yeah, I'd love to do the show there, and we'll, of course, have Into the Paranormal Saturday nights. I'm Jeremy Scott from the cold, dark depths of a secret dungeon somewhere deep in the remote Pacific Northwest here in Portland, Oregon. On TalkCast PDX, I'm Jeremy Scott. Keep Portland Paranormal.